types of tests that are being done in these environments, being non-sport specific, being very, sterile types of environments. We've all done drop vertical jumps, right? We've all done that test. You hop off a box of a 30 centimeter box. You jump down. You cue an athlete to jump as high as you can. We've all done that test. We've all, we've seen that test, but it's a bilateral type of test, right? Where one, if we reverse engineer, the actual ACL injury, very rarely does it happen in a purely bilateral type of movement. It tends to be more unilateral dominant, whether it's a jump cut or whether it's a jump landing. So that kind of one is kind of a major kind of red flag with an assessment like that. It's like you don't tend to see non-contact ACL injuries occur in a purely bilateral type of maneuver, which a drop vertical jump is. So there's that, and it's also too is, this kind of gets into more of the sensory motor aspects. Like when you watch an athlete in a non-contact ACL injury, whether on the football field, soccer field, one of the main things that you'll start to see when you're picking up from a more mechanistic standpoint is their focus of attention isn't actually on, how they're performing the movement. It's on the external environment, where the defenders are, where they are in relation to the field, whether they're near the out of bounds boundaries, where their teammates are. Like you start to watch it and you start to see they really tend to be externally focused. Whereas when you do these types of assessments, it tends to be more of an internally dominant task where there's no focus on anything else. It's just the athlete, okay, I'm going to drop off the box now, and then I'm going to land, and then I'm going to jump up. Like that's where the focus is. And they've tried to kind of mitigate that through like hanging like a ball or some sort of apparatus and say, try to reach the ball and jump up as high as you can to try to get more externally focused, driven, if folks are familiar with some of the motor learning research that's out there. But still at the end of the day, like it's a pre-planned task. You step off a box, you land, you jump up. Whereas in sport, we know that that's not the case 99.9% of the time. Our athletes are often having to be reactive to the environment as opposed to, this idea of being everything being pre-planned. So that's where I think a lot of the disconnect comes from, is that, and I've been in these lab environments. I've gone through a master's in biomechanics, gone through a Ph.D. in biomechanics. I've conducted research similar to this in biomechanics lab, so I fully understand that side of things. But also, too, now being a practitioner and being in the field, I can kind of see this injury from both sides. And it's tough, too, because, from a research perspective, this is a much easier way of doing it and being able to screen hundreds and hundreds of athletes through, being able to do your biomechanical analyses. But at the end of the day, that sort of research hasn't really moved the needle. It hasn't provided clinicians and practitioners with very useful information in terms of these are the injury screening assessments that we can potentially do to try to see who's at risk. These types of assessments that we've done classically hasn't moved the needle. And so that's kind of started in, full disclosure, like when I first got into ACL injury, late into my undergrad, into my master's, like I was fully kind of on board with the biomechanical aspects of it. I was in that line of thinking of knee valgus. We got to train out knee valgus. This is the main one. But as I started to read more of the research, it kind of changed my mental model. Like, I don't necessarily think that this is the end all be all. I think there's something different. And kind of a little side story here. It's actually when I started to get into more concussion research is when I started to make the connection between the idea of the brain and how that potentially influences and downstreams into an injury like this. So just a little side note here. My Ph.D. research was looking at the relationship between concussion and non-contact lower extremity injuries and potentially the mechanisms as to why.
Okay.
And
What sports?
There's a lot of I was in my last couple studies were in a couple different sports, so football, soccer, and volleyball. Some of your more heavy concussion sports. And then did a couple studies with adolescent athletes when I was out at UNLV. But essentially what the research was at that point with concussions is that post-concussion, athletes were at higher risk for ankle injuries, knee injuries, your non-contact type of injuries. And so I started to read that research, the injury surveillance research. I was like, this is kind of interesting. I wonder if folks have ever tried to look at like a mechanistic link between a concussion and then a non-contact ankle sprain or an ACL type of injury, things like that, meniscus injury. And really at that point, back in 2018, there hadn't really been a lot of research out there that looked at it from a mechanistic perspective. So that's what my PhD research was focusing on, some of the biomechanics, but then also some of the neuropsychological aspects between sport concussion and then future risk for a lower body injury. But then I started to think, as I was going through my Ph.D. and finishing up there, I started to think, okay, what if you remove the concussion from the equation? Athletes hasn't had a concussion history. What are some of the neuropsychological sensory motor aspects that may just play directly into a non-contact injury, such as an ACL? And that's when I really have just started, and this is probably back in 2020-ish, about 2020-ish, is when I really started to just focus on removing the concussion, and I still have a lot of interest in the concussion non-contact relationship, but removing the concussion from the equation, what are some of the sensory motor aspects that may be driving, this relationship, and ultimately may be, a better way of going about thinking about mechanisms for ACL injury. So that's kind of how I've walked through, my own scientific endeavors and research about, this ACL injury. I was initially on that pure biomechanics train, but I thought as kind of I've studied the injury more over the last 6-7-ish years, I think there's something more that we need to tap into that can start to help us start to reduce the risk of this injury and start to see these injury incidences decline. And full disclosure as well, ACL injury, in my opinion, is probably the most complicated injury we see in sports medicine. There's just so many different factors that could potentially get involved in a non-contact. It may be anywhere from the surface on the field, the weather, prior injury history, current training. There's so many different factors, and folks that try to say, this is the mechanism or that is the mechanism, is just way off base and quite frankly providing just really bad information, and trying to sell people on like, okay, this is the cure-all, catch-all thing. It's so complicated. But I think, and this is where, as the research evolves and the science evolves, you can take different aspects of different strategies and interventions and hopefully combine those aspects together to create a comprehensive program. It's not easy. It's not easy by any means. But that's just kind of, my thoughts. I try to take a very 30,000 foot view on this injury, just because it is something I'm very, very passionate about and love to study. But at the end of the day, I just think there's more to it than just your knee valgus or doing a drop vertical jump test.
I 100% agree. And the way that my athletic trainer and I, the way that we would assess anybody that came in, we would look at, like, he would do a orthopedic screen and look at their joints and how they would move. Just, kind of following any of the FRC principles, like, hey, if your hip doesn't move, you don't have a hip, blah, blah, blah. There's going to be issues.
Right.
Then we would look at our lower body assessment of jumping. We would do a single leg vertical with a double leg takeoff, a single leg drop jump off of a 9-inch box to a double leg landing, and then a single leg broad jump to a double leg landing. And if we saw 2 out of the 3 with an asymmetry, we're like, hey, there's something going on here. Now, that was purely looking at physical. It was not looking at sensory motor.
Right. One of the things, though, that you mentioned, though, and that's important there, is you did a lot of that unilateral.
All of it unilateral with a double leg land. So that way, and that's where I think a lot of people get this stuff wrong, where they make it a single leg. Like, Kyle would also do a single leg takeoff to a single leg land. Just to check the boxes, because that's what the prior research has, but also just as a different way of collecting. But I was like, nah. And this is from where DeMarco and I worked together at Iowa, and we'd always bounce ideas off each other. It's like, look, I want a double leg land because I don't want them to worry about how they land. I want them to do maximal power production, let them land on 2 so we can see how powerful that leg really is. Now, none of that dials the sensory motor in, and you're the expert in it, and sticking with the Kier-Wenham flat ratio. You've noted the issues with it. What do you recommend to all of our listeners out there? Like, what would be the Jason A test, or like, what, you come up with something flashy for it, but like, what would you do?
Yeah, sure. And this is where, like, where the research is, you can be creative in fitting, like, what are going to be the demands of your athlete, right? Like an American football athlete versus a soccer athlete.
Shit, within American football, all the different positions, no?
Sure. Oh yeah, like, for sure. One of the things that we've started to explore, again, you kind of reverse engineer, the injury itself. And when does it tend to happen? It tends to happen when an athlete's more in like a deceleratory maneuver, right? Like they're going to do a jump cut or they're going to do a jump land. It's more in that deceleration phase. So there's ways that you can be creative in terms of your screening. What I would recommend to practitioners in terms of doing more field-based screening assessments is I would do it both under a pre-planned scenario, and then I'd also do it under a reactionary scenario, unplanned scenario, because where this starts to get into is this idea now of sensory motor. So like, say for example, you're going to do some sort of deceleration test, like the Damian Harper type of test, where
don't know what that is. I don't
know what that is.
Yeah, what is it?
Okay, yeah. If folks don't know what that is, essentially there's like a 15-meter buildup, and then there's like a 5-meter deceleration zone where it's a pure sprint out, and then you're into this deceleration zone, and you're decelerating as quickly as possible.
Decelerating and hitting a line like the 505 test, or like you sprint 15 yards and have to stop before the 5-yard mark.
You have to stop before the end of the 5-yard mark.
And are you measuring how fast somebody runs in the 15 so that way they're not cheating it, or what? Because I've seen things like...
Yes, you can use timing gates or GPS technology, things like that. So that tends to be more of a pre-planned sort of scenario there, where an athlete starting, builds up, boom, the deceleration starts right at that initial box part. But then you could also make it unplanned as well, where they're accelerating out, and then you still have, you maybe have like a larger deceleration area, but they don't start the deceleration until there's some sort of external cue, whether that's auditory or visual.
Now, how do you control for the randomization? Because I hear what you're saying. Like, hey, it's still a 20-yard drill, right?
Right.
Except they knew by the 15 to slow down. Like, how do you control for the randomization of if you're going to run a bunch of athletes through it? And how do you measure it? Are you videoing it? What are you doing? How do you recommend it?
Right. So a couple different things. From a randomization standpoint, I would say what you're going to have to do there is your cueing is going to have to be similar.
Using a whistle, like what?
Could be auditory, could be visual, and there's going to be a little bit of variance within that, but that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, because you're going to see variance on the field as well. It's not going to be standard. But really the main aspect there is you want to see how an athlete decelerates under a pre-planned scenario, and then also how they decelerate under a more reactionary scenario. And then two, kind of getting to your point, Justin, a couple different things there is video analysis is going to be helpful here. You can get that from sagittal plane. You can get that from frontal plane as well. And of course, if you're trying to add, some sort of a cutting task to it as well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pure deceleration, a pure, vertical, anterior, posterior type of test. You can also add a medial lateral component to it as well. But that would kind of be, I guess, a recommend. And like I said, you can be creative in this as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be that sort of assessment. If you wanted to do like a flying 10 and a cut to the left, cut to the right, 2 of those are pre-planned, and then 2 of those are going to be reactionary, where there's a cue here and you got to cut to the left, cue here, you got to cut to the right.
How would you score it though? That's the thing, because like I agree with you. Like, yeah, know, there's. Okay, you can make it pre-planned, not, and then it's just like, okay, in terms of maybe it's messy and you don't score it, and it's qualitative research, not quantitative. I hear what you're saying with that. And then the other part of my brain is I'm like, okay, we talked off air about, okay, there's already a lot of work on strength coaches' plates and now your plates. Like, who's going to filter through it? Is it you? Is it the AT? Is it the strength coach? How are we filtering through? How are we going to then communicate it? How are we going to, is there an intervention to improve it or not? Because it's just standard training. Like, all these thoughts are going through my head.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.